good knowledge of first aid is one of those things you hope you never have to use, but if you do, it might just be the most valuable thing you've ever learned. Steve Lewson is a first aid trainer specialising in care for little ones. He's got a course running this weekend. Steve, welcome to Saturday Brekkie.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So welcome. How much of a difference is there between first aid for adults and babies?
To be honest, that's a great question, Amber. It's without a doubt the number one thing that comes up. I'd say honestly 100% of courses I teach, just the amount of people that don't realise that there are some major differences between how we treat adults and how we treat little ones. So, for example, I will often demonstrate a basic choking procedure for babies, and people will say to me, "Oh wow, that's interesting. That's a new procedure." And I'll say it's not. I've been teaching the exact same thing for literally 29 and a half years. And yet they've never seen it before because they've done a typical general course where the focus is more adults. And as I say, little ones are quite often treated quite differently.
Oh my God, the terror that just rose up in my heart at the thought of an infant or a baby choking was just awful. What do you do with an infant that's choking? Is it possible to describe that on the phone?
Absolutely. I can give you the short version. So the best procedure we've got is still back blows, firm, sharp blows given between the shoulder blades of the child, always with the head down because we're aiming at trying to dislodge the object.
So
and if
upside down,
dislodge it,
holding baby by ankles.
No, not exactly, because it's too easy to drop the child that way. The way I always do it is literally on my knees on the floor with the child resting on my legs. So I'm supporting the head of the child. They're face down, and we then do firm back blows between the shoulder blades, up to 5 of those. If the child's too big, if it's not a baby, if it's a toddler, then the safest way is sitting in a chair with the child lying horizontally across your lap, again with the head down, just so that gravity is assisting you. And then same thing, back blows. If that does not work to dislodge the object, our second procedure is called chest thrusts, where you would turn the child over, and we would do firm compressions in the middle of the child's chest, exactly as we would for resuscitation. So quite firm compressions, quite sharp, the idea being to effectively squash the lungs and force air out the lungs and up to dislodge the object that way. So I guess hard to fully appreciate over the phone or over the radio, but that's our 2 best procedures.
But the visual demonstration, I think, with I imagine you've got a little doll or baby replica.
Absolutely, it's one of the most popular topics every course I teach without fail. If I say to the group right now, we're doing choking, and just the amount of people that suddenly sit up sharply and go, "Yep, that's the reason I've come to this course." I think choking's a major concern for obvious reasons.
My guest is Steve Lewson. He's a first aid trainer specialising in care for little ones. Tell me about the course you've got running this weekend. What else are you going to be covering, Steve?
So tomorrow morning, I've got a public course in Coburn. The primary topics are obviously resuscitation. That's the biggest topic by far. We spend a fair bit of time on choking, and then a range of the other common and most important childhood medical emergencies. So things like bleeding, burns, poisoning, which are some of literally the top 3 childhood injuries in Australia, and just essential for every parent and grandparent to know at least a little bit about.
And so, it's mainly grandparents, educators and parents that you're teaching. How much of the training is around keeping cool in the face of a potential incredibly stressful situation, Steve?
That's actually such an interesting question you asked, to be honest, Amber, because it's topic number 1 in my courses. I always say to people, there's a big difference between theory and practice, obviously. And I've always believed, I always say to people, I don't teach resuscitation as such, for example. I teach resuscitation for when people are panicking, because there's a big difference. So it's literally the first topic in my course, what to do in order to try and stay as cool and calm as possible, because you can't just learn all this information in a course and then expect to remember it forever. Obviously, memory fades with time, and especially a real situation involving the natural panic that occurs, and you've got to be able to stay as cool and calm as possible, remember your knowledge, and put it into practice to hopefully get a good outcome with the child.
And are there any key pieces of advice beyond that you give to people in your training, simple things that are often overlooked when it comes to keeping children and babies safe?
Well, I guess prevention is always better than cure. So, for example, one of the things I make a huge fuss about in my courses is burns and scalds, because it's one of the top 3 major childhood injuries. And the number one cause is tea and coffee. And to me, it's one of the most interesting parts of the work I do because, people realize a cup of hot coffee on a child obviously would be a horrendous injury. But what makes it more interesting and more scary, and I always make such a fuss about this, is if you consider every time you boil the kettle, you reach a temperature of about 100 degrees. But for a small child, their skin is so thin, they can suffer a life-changing or literally life-altering injury if the temperature of the water is approximately half that, just a little bit more than half that. So, people will be so careful with their boiling cup of tea around their child and, not hold the child at the same time and potentially leave that cup of tea for 5 minutes to cool down and think, okay, well, I'll be careful, but this is not a hot cup of tea now. They're holding the child, they're holding the hot cup of tea, something occurs and the injury is just so much worse than anticipated because, as I say, a child's skin is so much thinner. So you ask me a question like that, my first thought is that would just be a classic one, is it doesn't take a boiling hot cup of tea or coffee to cause damage. It can be what we think is just reasonably warm, and to a child, it's very, very hot and therefore dangerous.
Wow, the frown on my face right now, Steve Lewson, you should see it. Now, usually we try to feature events that are pretty cheap or even free here on Saturday Brekkie, but this one struck us as a pretty important thing to do for people who have little ones in their lives. For anyone wanting to come along this weekend, where can they find tickets, Steve?
Thank you. The best option would just be to have a look on my website, which is simply familyfirstaid.com.au. All one word, familyfirstaid.com.au.
And how much does it cost?
The cost for all of my courses, both public and private courses, is always $95 per person, and that's for a course that's about 3.5 hours long.
There you go. That's Steve Lewson. Thank you so much, Steve, our first aid trainer